As I come to the end of my return to the Kalahari Desert and forced to come to some evaluation of what I have seen on this agonizing journey, my mind goes back to the moment when I found the place where the Great Spirit in the beginning had knelt to pray over his creation. And I'd walked on from there, and I'd come to look here for what I had been told was a pool of everlasting water of life. On the first occasion it was brimful with water, and there was a tree growing here with the fruit of good and evil on it. On this occasion the pool was empty. The water had vanished. There was just a deep, deep hole, whereas if everything that the water meant symbolically in the spirit of the human being had compelled the water physically to withdraw from these hills. And the message was very clear. The spirit that presided over these hills had vanished too. They had, in a sense, like everything else in our technological age, they'd become ordinary hills. I would have thought that this was an inviolate fortress, that this was impregnable, but it's not. The water's gone, the tree's gone, the legends and the stories have gone. And I'm afraid this is the universal theme. Stone Age man, it seemed to me, as I look back on our journey, is vanishing in front of our eyes. These precious fragments we've shown to you, they are fragments of this. The integrated picture, which existed even 28 years ago, has gone. And how far it's gone, how a new and a much more strident age is coming in for all of us, including Stone Age man. We shall see in where our journey led us from here. One thing which had puzzled me on this journey was the absence of young men in all the Bushman clans we had encountered. As we moved out towards the fringes of the Kalahari, it was immediately explained. Since my day nearly 30 years ago, something like 2,000 new boreholes had been established in the Kalahari. And each new water point had brought hundreds of Africans and their cattle and their culture into what had been ancient and unadulterated Bushman ground. And this inevitably meant that the movement of the game on which the Bushman's way of life depended had been made utterly impossible, and the young men were drawn more and more into a Bantu way of life. With all the young men scattered and gone, the Bushman women are forced to do the best they can for themselves and for their children. And this woman is working for a Bantu farmer in return just for food for herself and her child. But in many places elsewhere, they are not even so lucky. They are forced to become prostitutes and concubines in order to keep their little unit together and alive. The vast Kalahari Desert transcended all political frontiers. It swept from the borders of the Transvaal, across Botswana, Namibia, right up to Mossamadis in Angola. And all this was Bushman country. And yet even here in the far north, on the edge of the great Etosha Pan, we found the Bushman working to repair one of the fences that had put an end to his traditional way of life. It was a fence built to protect a vast game reserve, to create a privileged life for the animal. But the irony of it was that nobody seems to have thought that the Bushman himself was in need of protection. And what could have been more remote from Stone Age life than to find yourself a vulnerable bushman, forced to mend railway lines on the edge of the great new cities that were being constructed ever and ever more closely to his ancient hunting grounds? The leakage of Stone Age man from his millennium-old context was complex and took place in so many ways. Who would have thought, for instance, that one would encounter a bushman working in this dispensary? Outside one saw these faces on the fringe of a capital, moving at nightfall towards the quarters where the black Africans were housed, where they lived again in a way that was totally alien to them. Even where the bushman's right to a life and identity of his own had some recognition, as it had in a part of Namibia, the kind of identity that the authorities had in mind had nothing to do with the bushman's own idea of his identity. This bushman was elected to represent his people in a very sophisticated political structure as minister of the Bushman people. What was he to make of these corridors of power and this intricate political bureaucracy with which he had now to deal. He was lucky in that he had an interpreter who spoke his language perfectly.
So aga shingwe hemi ngokrin ha anaiha waka eha te ko akan hate ngoka taiti kam kotik te ua ngui ha o te du umbongarero ko kondwa ha habe kam sa tini kondwa ha nati koresh he kam sa te shi e ham sa ko kui e warata ma ha
Here, ons is vanmorgen, lijkt me, onder die camera's weer. En ons het alles aan meneer Cassie te danken.
In trying to adapt himself to this new world, he seemed to us utterly confused, bewildered, and with no idea of how to handle this kind of life, either for himself or for his people.
Werkloos of al wees nie, ek hoop jy begryp almal presies wat dit beteken.
The estrangement between the Bushman people and the chief was perhaps best explained by the conditions under which his people were now made to live. They had permanent dwellings imposed upon them, dwellings fixed and in whose design they had no part. They had inadequate water supplies, and were, under their own conditions, they were always moving on. And when one shelter, one little settlement was no longer hygienically and economically viable, they just moved on, and in one day had established another. But now they were in the grip of an inflexible environment, where their water supplies were often tainted, and where all their natural immunities completely deserted them. They were increasingly subject to disease and decay. Here in the area which the chief represented, we found one of the last three of the great indignities our civilization has inflicted on primitive man: venereal disease, tuberculosis, and drink. In 1981, the chief was persuaded to allow the establishment of a bottle store. And from that moment, alcohol not only deprived the Bushman of what he had been, but reduced his capacity to adapt himself to the demanding technological environment which was confronting him. Ironically, almost immediately behind the bottle store, there was evidence of a more positive approach to the Bushman problem. A school has been established for Bushman children.
Tel met één hand op. Eén hand, tel één hand op. Tel één hand op. Hoeveel het jy daar? Hoeveel het jy? 3. Jy? 3. Goed, sit hom neer. Tel met 2 hande.
We would have been more hopeful for schools of this kind If we thought that when the Bushmen finally emerged from establishments such as these, that he would be released into an environment in which he could walk equal in dignity with all people. But alas, such an environment does not yet exist.
Marcus! Up! Marcus! Up die Flagge!
In the far northwest of the Kalahari Desert, we had an encounter, which was perhaps the most dramatic of all. We found the Bushmen being trained by a very efficient and forceful Afrikaans sergeant major into becoming our concept of a soldier.
Ons lees vanmôre saam uit Johannes 14 vanaf vers 1. Julle moet nie ontsteld wees nie, glo in God, glo ook in my. In die huis van my Vader is daar baie woonplek. As dit nie so was nie, sou ek dit vir julle gesê het. Ek gaan om vir julle plek gereed
As
te
I
maak.
listened to the sermon, I was deeply disturbed by the unconscious hypocrisy, because the sermon was based on that incomparable New Testament text. In my Father's home, there are many mansions. How could you possibly, I thought as a parson, be so insensitive as to say this to people whose home had been taken away from them everywhere in southern Africa?
En julle ken daardie pad. Maar daar's net een pad na die hemel toe. En dit is deur Jesus Christus. En daarom as jy in Jesus Christus is, het jy die pad na die hemel toe.
We followed him through his training in a battle exercise conducted with live ammunition for our benefit. What impressed us most was how these scattered and different remnants of Stone Age man seemed to have endeared themselves to their military instructors, because these hardened men, who are so colour and race conscious, told us quite openly that if ever they were forced to leave this part of the northern Kalahari Desert, they would, if they had the power, like nothing better than to take the Bushmen back with them. This then, for me, was the end of the search. With a considerable section of what was left of Stone Age man, inextricably involved with us in the violence and the destruction of our time. Clearly, this was the end, too, of all hope of a future for Stone Age culture. The fault, the error, as throughout history, was in our own blind senses and in our own hardened hearts. It was far too much bother for us to consider the future of the Bushman, to see that he had a land of his own and a way of life of his own. There was a profound imperviousness in our imagination, which still rejected Stone Age man. We would flock to the Kalahari Desert to discover him as an object of curiosity, to measure his head, to see what blood groups he belonged to see how his physique different from other men. In fact, he was just seen as a subject for new study, as a thesis for a new doctorate. Of course, there were one or two exceptions. I think of John Marshall, who had known the Bushmen as I had done as a child, as a very honorable and inspiring exception, who's trying out of his own money and knowledge to convert them into a cattle-owning people. It's a small beginning, and it might lead to other things. But ultimately, we have to find a way in which he can merge with us without loss of dignity. And we have to rediscover what this man, when all the odds were against him, had to give us of what was truly illuminating and creative. We live in a sunset hour of time, and the darkness is closing in on the road to which the sun, the great image of reason, has brought us. And it's almost as if I hear the Kalahari wind from across the world bring up to me the voice of mantis, this insect, which for the Bushman was the voice of the infinite in the small. And it's the voice of mantis as he spoke in a moment of his own great darkness, when his own beloved Ierland had been destroyed and the world seemed to be crashing around his ears. And out of this moment of desperation, he found a feather of new awareness of the bird of fire, and threw it up into the sky and told it, "You shall henceforth be the moon. You must shine at night, and by your shining shall you lighten the darkness until the sun rises again to light up life for all men." And if this brief and final testament from the great Bible of Bushman and Stone Age life we have lost can help us all to find what is represented by the light of the moon in the human spirit, the shy, intuitive perceptions which enable men to find a way out when reason has failed. The Bushmen will not have lived in vain.